Today is September 3rd, 2024, and this is William Michael, the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When I was in college, the internet was just developing. I was in college from around 1995 through 2001, and while I was at Rutgers, we began to use email. We began to communicate with professors by email, and some professors, towards the end of my studies, started to post course websites. And at that point, that's really all that the internet was. It was just a place where you could get information. The course website might include the content of the syllabus, the professor's contact information, maybe some links to some documents you could download, and so on. That was really all that the course website was. When I look at what colleges are doing today, and we're talking almost 25 years later, colleges are still operating as they did, for the most part. They're still operating as they did before the internet, or when the internet was first getting started. We can say that there have been some developments, some changes. Some may think they're significant changes, but I work full-time in online learning. I've been devoted to online learning since 2008, when, as a classroom teacher, I became convinced that we were just wasting too much time trying to continue to have schooling in school buildings, on the ground, in person, when it was costing so much money and so little was being accomplished. The day school that I taught at here in Charlotte, and again, this was back in 2008, so we're talking 16 years ago, the day school tuition, that means dropping kids off in the morning and picking them up after school. Day school tuition was $17,000, $18,000 a year. And as I was working in that school, I was the upper school classics teacher. I went through my daily activities constantly thinking to myself, we are wasting so much time and doing so many things so inefficiently. And I would watch as a quarter of the staff turned over every year, and all new teachers were brought in over the summer, and we had teachers beginning their first year teaching, redesigning courses, starting everything from scratch, throwing away everything the previous teacher had done, and this went on every single year. And I just looked at this circus and said to myself, there's no way, with the resources we have available today, there's no way that this makes sense anymore. It's so inefficient, so expensive, and it really accomplishes so little. I thought that at the high school level. And when I look at college courses, I look at the things that my own kids are doing, I look at the things that my wife and I have done in courses that we've taken, I just can't believe how poorly modern schools are using the tools available to us for online learning. I really can't believe that much of what's being done in terms of college studies, college courses, and things like that, I can't believe how much of it is really just continuing to follow the model that was in place before the internet, and is just using the internet as some sort of convenience tool while continuing to do things in the same way. I'd like to take some time, and again, I've got 16 years working full-time in online learning, and even still, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface in terms of what's possible and what should be done, as we don't merely use technology to do old things in a different way, but we actually think of how things should be done in light of the available technology. And I'd like to share some thoughts about this because I'd like to make sure that parents in the academy working with me and just others who talk to me about school administration and things like that have a chance to hear some of the things that I think about these things, because I have a lot of experience in online learning. As I said, the problem that I see when most people get involved with computers is that they do old-fashioned things. They do old-fashioned things with new tools. So if we go back and you think of how a school ran in, let's say, 1990, right? You would sign up for a college course. You would either go to the registrar's office and register in person, standing in a line to register for your courses, or your school might have a high-tech registration system like Rutgers did, where you could call in on the phone and use the keypad to enter in the information for your registration. The touch-tone registration system. I can still remember the voice and all the prompts 25 years later. But that's how you registered for courses. You got a paper catalog from the registrar's office. You went through the catalog, made your schedule, and then called in on the touch-tone system and registered for your classes. And then when the school year started, you either lived on campus or you lived close to the campus, either at home or in an off-campus apartment, and you commuted to campus. Everyone went to school on campus. All classes were on campus. Attendance was mandatory. Professors were in the classrooms lecturing, teaching, and things were very different because the way that courses work, my kids in college today can't even comprehend, really. And I'm not saying this as a whiny old man. I'm saying this because it's true. We had textbooks that we had to purchase, and textbooks cost hundreds of dollars. I remember one of the biggest challenges in going to college was the cost of textbooks. You'd take 4, 5, 6 courses, and you'd be $500-$600 in textbooks easily each semester. I remember that being a real challenge, just getting the books. And then once you got your books, then you got your class schedule, and you had to be on campus, like I said, go to class, and the professor would lecture. And the content of the lecture would provide content for the tests and exams. So you had to be at class, you had to attend the lecture, you had to take notes. And if you weren't in class taking notes, doing all the readings, you had really no chance to get good grades in the class. And then the exams would be announced, and the examinations would be, at a given time in the classroom, proctored by the professor. You were allowed no notes. You couldn't bring anything. You had to come sit down for 2 or 3 hours and take exams. And you had to answer all the questions. There might be 30, 40 questions, multiple choice type questions from the semester of readings. There might be some short answer questions, comprehension questions that needed to be answered, and then there were usually 2 or 3 essay questions to answer. And that all had to be done. You had one shot, one grade, and it would be 30, 40% of your grade for the semester. And I remember just studying. First of all, I remember doing all the reading, attending the classes, taking pages and pages and pages, notebooks filled with notes, and then rewriting all those notes to prepare to study, because I knew that if I didn't have all the readings done, all the notes written out, all the notes organized, and leave myself a week to study all the notes, that I wouldn't be able to earn an A on the exam. And it was very stressful, very difficult, and at the same time, I think very helpful in challenging us to learn, and very rewarding when we did well. It was very, very stressful studying when I was in college, and I remember the sense of relief and joy at the end of the semester, especially when my wife and I because we went to the same school together. Getting good grades and being able to finish for Christmas break or for summer break, it was just so satisfying because it was so difficult. And when I look at what my kids are doing today, it's nothing like, nothing like what it was like 20 years ago. And it's because we've adopted these online tools, but we're making very stupid use of them. What we're doing is really terrible. And the professors, educators in general, I would say, are not rethinking education in light of the tools that are available. They're just doing the same old thing. But they're using the tools, and the tools are being used to just take away all the difficulty of the studies. And I'll give you some examples. For one thing, half the courses can be taken online. Asynchronous studies, they call them. But what it means to take a course online is it's degenerated so far. Let me just explain to you. I took a graduate course last semester at Harvard. Let me explain what the course consisted of. It was a course on the philosophy of religion. So winter semester course, spring semester I guess we call it, spring semester course from January through April into May, 16 weeks. We studied a textbook on the history of the philosophy of religion, which was actually authored by our professor, which was great. The textbook itself was great. And then in addition to the textbook readings, we had readings from some historical sources, some writings of philosophers, things like that were collected for the course. So we had primary source readings and a textbook to study. And then twice a week, the professor gave a lecture. He gave a lecture on Tuesday and Thursday mornings on campus at Harvard, which was live streamed for remote students to either watch at the time it was live streamed or to watch on their own schedule whenever they had a chance. It was recorded, so it could be watched at any time. And in the lectures, he would simply talk about the content in the textbook. Remember, he wrote the textbook. The textbook was the content of these lectures. So I would watch the lecture to get an introduction to the content and just make sure there were no announcements or anything. I would watch the lectures at my own convenience. Actually, I watched them while I walked on the treadmill. And then I would sit down to read the textbook, take notes on the textbook, and make sure I had all the content, read the primary source readings. And I got all the studies done because obviously I'm motivated for a course on the philosophy of religion. It was a great course, a really great course. I was motivated. I studied very diligently. But what's different is the assessments. The assessments were just ridiculous. So first of all, for every reading, so twice a week, the reading assignments were due Tuesday and Thursday. Every Tuesday and Thursday at 9 a.m., we had to make a post on a class forum. So we had to, as we did our reading, we had to come up with any topic that interested us, but we had to post on the course forum under the subject for the week's reading. We had to post an original post, and then we had to reply to one of our classmates' posts. Now, in order to make this twice a week post, actually, it was not necessary to study carefully because you could make up whatever topic you wanted. It just had to be relevant to the assigned subject. But there was no measure of whether you studied the text, whether you read it all carefully and completely. You just had to have something intelligent to say when you made your post, and then you had to reply to someone else's post. I think it was required like 50 words to reply to someone else's post, and we had to do that twice a week for the entire semester. So that was the first requirement. Just I mean, as easy as could be. It's like chatting on social media. That was one of the assignments for the course. Then, in addition to that, the professor gave 10 writing opportunities, he called them. 10 writing opportunities, which were short essays. There were 10 that were given for the entire semester that addressed the different subjects that were studied throughout the course. And of these 10 essay opportunities, we had to pick 4. We had to get 2 done before the midterm, and then we had the rest of the semester to get 2 more done. So 4 writing opportunities out of 10 possible assignments. So think, as I talk about these things, realize how little of the content actually needed to be mastered, how little demonstration of mastery was required. There was no mastery needed for the forum discussion posts, and you could pick 4 out of 10 of the writing assignments. So you didn't sit for a test and have to answer a question. You got to pick out of 10 essay topics, or the professor didn't just assign a topic. You got to pick 4 out of 10 over the course of the semester. Easy. I got almost perfect scores on each one. And then in addition to that, there was a midterm and a final. The midterm, I think there were 25 questions. This is a midterm. I think there were 25 questions, and I think there were a few short comprehension type questions. And that was it. It was more like a short test, and that was the midterm exam. I think on the first exam I got 1 question wrong, and then on the final exam I think again I got 1 or 2 questions wrong. Just easy, and that was the course. That was it. And so my point is the level of mastery between what was required by this course in 2024 versus what I had to do as an undergraduate student was night and day. I couldn't, I still can't believe how easy these courses are. I don't understand why they're so easy. I don't understand why the standards for assessment are so low. None of the difficult work that was needed when I was in college is required. My own children, in their college courses, I hardly even see them studying, and they're Dean's List students. It's just very strange to see how much the standards have changed. Now, the reason why I believe the standards have changed so much is because the technology has been implemented, but the old content is still the content in the courses, and the old assessment methods are being retained, but not like they used to be administered, not in the same high-risk way they used to be administered, where it was like, sink or swim on an exam that determined 40% of your grade and might be 50 questions with essays. And then essay projects in addition to that, and attendance required, and written assignments. It's like taking the same approach to the content, but not having proctored exams anymore. Just to clarify, the exam that I had to take, it was provided for me online. I was allowed to take it whenever I wanted to within a time period for testing. I was allowed to take it. There was no restriction on what I could do. I could look things up on the internet if I wanted to. I took the exam online. And the only rule was that the exam would close in 1 hour. So I had 1 hour of time to get the exam done. And when I think about that and compare that assessment opportunity, where I get the exam, I can take it when I want, I can take it at home, totally unsupervised. I could look things up if I wanted to. I don't think I needed to, but I could look things up if I wanted to. and I simply had to get whatever I got done in an hour. That's how the technology is being used. And I think about that compared to being seated for an exam in 2000, waiting for the professor to hand out the exams, having no idea what was on the exam exactly, knowing that the professor would be wandering through the room the whole time, making sure that no one had any notes, no one had anything but the exam on their desk, and that the exam would be collected, and that was it. There was no retake, there was nothing, no options. It was just all or nothing examination, and I had to study like crazy to make sure that I had mastered every page of every reading assignment and reviewed all the notes from every lecture to make sure that there was nothing that could appear on that exam that I wasn't familiar with. Whereas the course I took, 2 courses I took at Harvard, nothing remotely close to that was needed. In fact, when I was asked to write my evaluations, I complained that the courses were too easy. Now, the reason why I think this is happening, and I'm not bragging because the courses are not easy because I'm smart. The courses are easy because the assessment is not rigorous. There's no mastery required for the assessment. The technology is being used, but the same approach to learning is being used even though the circumstances have changed. And because the same approach to learning is being used, the tools that are available can just be used to make a joke out of the assessment. And it's really ridiculous. And this is what I believe is wrong with modern schools that are offering online courses. And let me dig into this a little bit now to get practical and talk about what should be done and why. The tools that we have, the fact that we're able to work remotely, the fact that study materials are able to be obtained freely, the fact that we don't need to live on campus, we don't need to commute to campus, we don't need to attend a lecture in a classroom, we're able to have our own schedules. We're able to study around the clock, on and on and on. All of these advantages, all of these great, great advantages that the internet and computers and technology has made available to us, they can't be used to do the same thing that was being done before. What we were actually doing before was minimal. What we were actually doing before was actually covering a relatively small amount of material in a very inefficient way. A small amount of material in a very inefficient way. But because the assessments were really difficult, cheating was very difficult because the assessments were live and proctored and so on. Because the assessments were so difficult, we felt like our education was really challenging, really difficult. But really, we were studying very little. It was just very difficult to get high scores, to get good grades. So we felt like we were doing a lot of work, but we really weren't doing very much. We've taken that same quantity of material, that same standard for content, and we've just moved it online with all of these different circumstances. So now that little bit of content that we studied is now easily accessible to the students. It's accessible 24 hours a day, and the assessments are far less difficult than they were before. So not only has the low standard been retained, but the quality of assessment has declined. And so, whereas before I might have argued that we were getting a low quality education at very great cost, very, very challenging, very difficult. Like I said, you have to be on campus, you had to attend lectures, you had to buy books, you had to study in inconvenient places because there was no internet. You had to go to the library, find a place to study, sit with books and take notes. Exams were given out in class and proctored by the professors. And it was very difficult, even though the amount of material was not very great. It was difficult. Today, we've got the same low amount of information, easily accessible with easy assessment that doesn't even test mastery of that content. And so I would argue that online courses, because there's really no rethinking of how education should be done with these new circumstances. Education has declined because of the technology. And like I said, the reason why is because the technology changes everything. It allows us to do much more. And let me just, again, let me be really practical with this talk. I don't want to be theoretical because the evidence for what I'm saying can be provided easily. If I take a course, if I take a college course, either when I was in school or now, I take an online course, let's say, my professor is not going to assign us to read the Summa Theologica. First of all, to buy it would cost how much money? I mean, hundreds of dollars if you bought a new copy, or you'd have to borrow it from a library or buy some used paperback copies, whatever. It just wouldn't be possible to say that the text for our course is going to be the Summa Theologica, or the text for our course is going to be the philosophical works of Aristotle, and you need to buy, this or that, whatever. Usually, you're given an anthology, like when I was at Rutgers back before the internet. The professors used to prepare course booklets, and they would be basically a collection of the readings photocopied for us. All the photocopies that needed to be read over the course of the semester would be put together and bound with an old tape binding, and you'd have to go to this bookstore on campus where they made all these tape-bound document booklets to buy your readings for the semester. And so just to get materials, there was no way that you could read the sources. So you were always given portions of the sources to read that were selected by the professor. Or you got a textbook that copied and pasted readings from the sources, but you would never read the sources directly. It just wasn't practicable. Today, that's not the case. Today, I can assign my students to read Aristotle's Organon and just give them links to online PDF copies of the primary source itself and have them read from the sources directly. The Summa Theologica can be our course textbook. The Catholic Bible can be our sacred scripture textbook. Any course that I want to teach, I can give the students the primary source materials to study, because I can just give them a PDF that costs $0 and they have access to 10 volumes of the Cambridge Ancient History for $0. And so you can see that the online tools we have make the study materials available to us infinitely better than they could have been before. Infinitely better. And there are movements that are taking advantage of this. For example, with respect to modern mathematics and modern natural sciences, Rice University has a project called the OpenStax, I think that's what it's called, OpenStax textbook project, where they're making new modern science and math textbooks available in PDF format for free. And millions of students today are studying from these OpenStax textbooks because they're free. They're distributed in PDF copies. It's a nonprofit organization. It's privately funded, and they put together these textbooks, beautiful modern textbooks written by college professors and researchers. and they put these beautiful textbooks together, and instead of putting them all into print and making everyone spend $125 for textbooks, they just make the textbooks available for free in PDF form. And just think of how that changes our opportunities to study. And one thing I notice about those books is that where you may have gotten a textbook, excuse me, you can remember probably the size of a textbook back in the 1990s, if you're as old as I am. You'd have this like 2-inch thick textbook, 1.5-inch thick textbook. They had to be a certain size because they had to be printed. Whereas now, because the book really isn't going to be printed, you can get a book that's 1,500 pages with tons of more content. You don't really have to worry about wasting paper space, wasting page space. If you want to include extra illustrations or extra pages for summaries and things like that, you can. Because there's really no concern for the number of pages that are going to be in the book, because it's not going to be printed. So one of the things that's different because of technology is we have the ability to study so much more than we could before. We have the ability to study from higher quality sources, and by higher quality I mean more primary sources, not anthologies or commentaries and things like that. We can study primary sources directly, books that we could never have afforded to study from before. These are now available to us for free as digital texts. So the quality of the study materials is far, incomparably better. The quantity of study materials and cost is incomparably better today because of what's available. And yet what we see is that schools and colleges are still doing things the old-fashioned way. They may put books online, or they make the study materials available, but they're making the same kinds of study materials available that were available 20 years ago. They're doing the same things that they used to do, but they're using modern technology. Just using technology to do old-fashioned things instead of rethinking. Instead of saying, look, I understand when we used to teach, let's say, theology, we couldn't have every student have a copy of the Summa Theologica. And so we would read anthologies, or we would read bits and pieces of different parts of the Summa and so on. And that's how we taught and studied the Summa, because that's how the books were available back then. Well, let's ask the question, if every student had a copy of the entire Summa and it was free, and he could have the Latin text, he could have an English translation, he could have both. If they had access to the whole Summa, wherever they were, 24 hours a day, would we use anthologies, or would we redesign our courses and think differently about how we should study these subjects, what we should study, and so on? Is the anthology approach an approach that was designed because of the cost and difficulty of accessing the sources? Or is the anthology method actually a better method that should be retained even when the source materials are freely available? I think that anthologies were used because having access to the sources was not realistic, not feasible. When the resources are available, I think the anthology approach is no longer necessary. And in fact, I think it's harmful, because it would be better, especially if we're preparing, as we always say, we're preparing students for lifelong learning. Well, they're going to be studying from the primary sources throughout their lives. Like, I don't think I've ever, in my life outside of college, I don't think I've ever grabbed one of my old college textbooks off the shelf and said, oh, let me grab that anthology to find, that quote from the Summa. No. If I want a quote from the Summa, I go directly to the Summa, and I do so online. The whole entire text searchable on my desk 24 hours a day. The access to the document is far better today, and if I'm going to study for my entire life, I'm going to use the resources that are available to us online, the complete resources, the free resources. I'm not going to go to anthologies and stuff like that. It makes no sense. We have more available for less. We have more available for less. And I think that needs to change our goals for our courses. I think that needs to change the way we study. I think that needs to change the way we assess mastery of these subjects. I think it needs to change what we define as mastery in these courses. I think the assignments need to change. I think that everything needs to become much more rigorous. Much more rigorous, because studying today is so much more convenient. We have no more excuse to study like we did in 1990. There's no excuse. There's no excuse to study as little as we did, because, well, the classes had to be scheduled, and we could only meet for 2 hours a week, and sometimes classes would be canceled, and then you had to do, you had the readings for the class, but then you had a study sheet for these. Like, all of those obstacles and difficulties and hindrances that limited what we could do, those are all gone now. There's no more hindrances. There's no more of those obstacles. No more of those physical hindrances to study. I have access to my study materials 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Does it even make sense to have semesters? Does it even make sense to break courses up into the subjects that we do? Look at a college course catalog. It's really just like a chaotic menu of topical subjects. Like I said, last semester, I took a course on the history of the philosophy of religion. The semester before that, I took a course on the founding of the Constitution and the ratification debates of 1788. The courses are really like topical studies. And we have this expectation that we're going to take a course for 15, 16 weeks. There's going to be a certain amount of content. It's going to meet for a certain amount of time. And we need 40 of these courses to earn an undergraduate degree. And you can choose those 40 courses out of hundreds of different courses that are available, like TV shows. You can just choose from all kinds of electives and different studies at all different levels and different subject areas and so on. The changes that have taken place, I argue, change the way we should approach education. Everything is different. Everything is different. I can introduce to a student to the Summa Theologica when he's 13 years old. I can introduce him to the text of the Summa Theologica. I can introduce him to the Latin text of the Summa Theologica when he's 13 years old. And we can spend 5 years together in high school surveying the entire content of the Summa Theologica, translating the content of the Summa Theologica. We couldn't do that before. We couldn't have this course continue over 5 years. Why? Because, well, the kids' parents could move, there are kids coming in and out of schools, kids transferring all over the place. So if you study 7th grade in New York and then your family moves to Florida, your coursework has to transfer, and the new school has to kind of be where your old school left off, because we're physically moving from one school to another. Online learning just destroys all of that. With online learning, there's no more geographical limitation. If your family moves from New York to Florida, who cares? Your online courses are completely untouched. You just continue studying. And so all of these geographical limitations, all of these problems that remain in modern schools are really anachronistic. They don't make sense anymore. We're having problems in education that belong to an age that's past. And the online learning eliminates these problems. And so if we ask, well, why do they still exist? It's because we're perpetuating these systems that no longer need to be perpetuated just because, and this will make some people upset, but it's true, because the teachers and administrators are too lazy to think about these things. We're too lazy. There are too many people making a living off of the old way, and they just don't want to be bothered with this. They don't want to be bothered with rethinking education in light of the technology. So what they're doing is just making stupid, pointless use of available technology to do things that don't even make sense anymore. You know, and I'm conscious of this and sensitive to this because I have two goddaughters who go to public school, and I see what they do. The bus shows up to pick them up at 7 o'clock in the morning. So they're hustling out of the house to get to the bus, and they've got their backpacks and all their stuff and their computers tucked under their arm. They're carrying their Wi-Fi laptops to a school building to use the internet that they have at home to study things that are available to them at home, and they're restricted to study those things to the school calendar when all of that is available. Why are they being bused from their home to a school building to log on to the internet and access online resources that are available at home? It doesn't make sense. It makes no sense. And then school closes for Christmas break, and everyone acts like all of those resources that they were using in early December can't be used again until school reopens in January, or what they were working on in June now needs to stop and wait to be resumed in September when school... You can just see how pointless this is. It defeats the whole point of having the technology when it's going to be used in an almost spitefully unproductive way, almost counterproductive way. Doesn't make any sense. We have access to better resources at little or no cost. Little or no cost. Let me give you another example. If you were to buy yourself a printed copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, I think it would cost you over $1,000. I think it would cost like $1,200. I'm not sure, but I think it would be over $1,000. Let me look it up real quick. Hold on one second. Yeah, the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, is 20 volumes. You can buy it in print for $1,200. So if you'd like to have a copy of the Oxford English Dictionary, you can have it for $1,200. I purchase the Oxford English Dictionary online. I purchase an institutional subscription for the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, for the whole entire academy. So every single student in the academy has free access to the Oxford English Dictionary online. And I think it cost me $700 a year. $700 for every single student to have 24/7 access to a dictionary that costs $1,200 for one copy. Every single student in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy has 24/7 free access to the Oxford English Dictionary. Same is true for the Loeb Classical Library. I think it's 500 volumes. They're between $20 and $30 a piece. And I buy the whole entire subscription for the Academy students. I think it's $500. All of my students have free access to the Loeb Classical Library, every single volume, Latin and English, online. All of the works of classical Greece and Rome, in Greek and Latin with English translation. It's freely available to all of our students in their own home, on their own computer, 24 hours a day. So when you consider the resources, there's just no comparison. Our courses study the primary sources directly. There's just no comparison between what can be studied today using online resources with what could be studied in schools 20 years ago and what is studied in schools today, because they're doing things the old-fashioned way in spite of the technology. So I think that's enough about content, right? We can see the content is radically different. And I think we have to rethink education because this content has changed so drastically for the better. The second problem has to do with instruction. I recently posted a talk where I said that students do not need lectures. Students do not need teachers like they did in the past. And in that talk I get into this in detail, but to make it simple, in the Middle Ages, the reason why there was a lecturer was because nobody had any books. The printing press wasn't developed until the mid-1400s. Nobody had books. And so the lecturer was, if you think of the word lecture, it's derived from lego, which means to read. The lecturer was literally telling the students the content of the books. And the students were learning the content by listening to the lecturer. That's why they used to refer to teaching as reading. If you notice the language, they used to refer to it as reading. Because the lecturer was simply would read, let's say, Aristotle's logical works or Aristotle's philosophical works. They would read them in class. And then the teacher would often comment on them and help the students to understand them, sort of preview a reading. It was called a prelection. And then read the text and then provide some commentary. And then the students would often memorize the text. That was necessary because students had no books. And, that continued for centuries and centuries, because even after the printing press, books were still difficult to get a hold of. It was still very expensive to provide students with books. And so that structure of the classroom, the lecturer standing at the front of the class and all of the students listening and learning the content of the books from the lecturer, was the normal structure of the school because of how the information was to be accessed. Well, after books became more readily available, and this was owed to public schooling because the government started buying the books and the publishers started publishing for government purchases. Well, the books became more abundantly available. Now all of a sudden students have copies of books, but the structure of the schools didn't change. Even when we were in school, even today, the structure of the school hasn't changed. And so now what we get is this dopey copying of the methodology of medieval lecturers. We've got a teacher who's going to teach a literature class in 2024, and we've got this guy standing in the front of the classroom with notes, lecturing students who have access to all of the resources in print. Why is the school arranged like that? It makes no sense. There's no need to have this dumb arrangement in the school where the kids all sit there like a bunch of bookless illiterates, and the teacher presents the information to them as if they don't have a book. We've just continued to arrange the school in the old-fashioned way, even though it doesn't make sense anymore. And while that's true of teachers teaching with students who have the books, it's even more ridiculous when you realize that not only do students have books, students have free digital copies of all of these books. Students have access to YouTube. Students have access to podcasts. What in the world are we doing making student learning dependent on whoever happens to be the local school teacher? It really makes no sense. You know, if you lived in, let's say, London or New York City in history, you are likely to be able to find good teachers. Some of the leading teachers would be in those cities. Some of the best schools would be in those cities. If you lived in a small town, you were in trouble because you were just going to get, you know, Mary Crabtree as your teacher, and you know that's all the education that you were going to get. Whatever Mary happened to learn, she would share with you, and maybe you could get a chance to go to college and learn from some better teachers in a university town. But local resources limited what students had access to. There were geographical restrictions. That's gone today. There's no geographical restriction today. And so why we're having a group of Christians, let's just use an example, a group of Christians start a school. They don't have good teachers. They don't have money. They can't buy good teachers. There's no good teachers in their area where they live. But there's good teachers online that those kids in that area could study from and learn from. But instead, they set the school up as if there's no online teaching, as if there's no online resources. They set the school up and make the kids dependent on the local teachers, and the school stinks. And they have 30% turnover every year. And if you're asking, why in the world in 2024 would you organize a school that makes students dependent on local teachers? That was the whole problem with school before the internet. Why are we we're not just stuck in the old way. We're starting brand new schools. I see it every year. Brand new schools started and organized in a way that makes no sense in 2024. And if you look, and like, I know that everybody wants to be nice because we're supposed to say, oh, these are just good people. They're trying to do good. They're trying to help people. No, it doesn't make any sense. They're hiring the lowest quality people for these teaching jobs. People have no experience, no expertise. They're not good teachers. They don't have money for good resources. And they organize this so-called private school with no money, no resources, no personnel. And they do it as if starting a school is intrinsically good, with no respect to the actual objective quality of the study materials, facilities, resources, personnel, methods, and so on. And it's just not fair to the kids. It makes no sense why schools are continuing to do that in 2024. So the first problem was the study materials. The second problem is the way the schools are arranged and how teachers work, that teachers organize these classes around themselves for no reason. It makes no sense. But that continues today. And again, we're not thinking, how should a school in 2024 be arranged? How should a student be educated in 2024? Because everything is different. So first was the content, the study materials. Second is the teaching and the arrangement of the school. And then thirdly is assessment, the actual work that students are asked to do. When we realize that all of these other things have changed, the work that the students do has to change. The activities that made sense in 1990 or in 1850 in Little House on the Prairie, they don't make sense anymore. They don't make sense. Back in the 1800s, you could have kids stand up and recite the spelling rules. And why were they memorizing the spelling rules? Well, they were memorizing the spelling rules because they had no book. And so in order to learn them, you had to memorize them. Well, today you can have the book. Today you can have a poster for the wall. Today you can have a card to stick in your pocket. So memorization, even though it's beneficial in some ways, which I could talk about in another lecture, because I do think memorization is very important for some subjects, memorization was used for all subjects because that was the only way that you could carry the knowledge with you, was to memorize it. That's not true today. And there are many things today that because of technology, because of resources we have, it's actually a bad use of time, and it really just a way of cluttering your head with information that doesn't need to be in your head. For example, I'm not going to memorize the Liturgy of the Hours. I'm going to carry my prayer book with me wherever I go. And if I don't have my prayer book, I can access it online. I'm not going to memorize the Liturgy of the Hours. I'm not going to spend hours and hours and hours a day memorizing the Liturgy of the Hours. I never sat down and memorized the Rosary, for example. I just prayed it using a card that I had. I still have the card in my prayer book. I prayed the Rosary using the card and prayed it and prayed it and prayed it and prayed it, and then after a while I memorized it. Same thing with Mass, same thing with the Apostles' Creed, and so on. There are some things we pick up by memory because we actually repeat them all the time. But there are other things where we've got to actively work to memorize them. And so we've got to ask the question, what should be memorized and what is a waste of time to be memorized? Back in the 1800s, like I said, there were many things memorized that today don't need to be memorized. And yet we're memorizing them. Why? Because they memorized them in the 1800s, as if everything is the same. So the way that we study is different today because of the resources. And I know we get all of this, like this doomsday talk about, well, what's going to happen if the power grid goes down and nobody can access the internet and no one can use their smartphone. What's going to happen then? Well, you know what I guess Tommy, who memorized the phone book, is going to be able to make a job, make a living giving people other people's phone numbers. But the problem with that whole argument is that if we're living in doomsday circumstances where there's no electricity, we're not going to be worried about education at this level. We're not going to worry about these things. And I think that doomsday attitude and all that talk about, well, what if the survivalist mentality, I think it's an excuse to not work. It's like saying, well, if the power grid goes down, obviously we're not going to need to, memorize calculus lessons. Well, so what? So then you don't study calculus? That's really what this is about. It's about, using this doomsday talk to just get out of present day work while everything is fine, and we're not even sure that there will ever be such a doomsday moment. So I think that's a bunch of baloney. I think it's used, especially by Christians, as an excuse to not work. But if the power grid is down, we're probably not going to be worried much about our grammar or our Latin translation skills or our pre-calculus problems and things like that. So it's not going to be a concern. But the reality is the grid is not down, and it has not been down at any point in our lives, and it's unlikely that it's going to go down. And so we should operate and study and work assuming that things are going to stay more or less as they are. And like I said, if things radically change, we're not going to care about these things. We're going to be trying to find food, so it wouldn't matter. But we've got to ask, with these resources that are available, the constant access we have to them, how should education change? With access to all of the resources, where we have access from our homes to the best teachers in the world, how should teaching and school arrangement change? Do we even need teachers? Do we need lectures? And if we do need lectures, who should be lecturing? Probably not local lady who happens to be available to teach second grade. So it changes the way schools are organized, changes who the lecturers should be, if anyone. Again, I don't think lecturing is necessary today because we have such easy access to the resources. And then with assessment, we have to rethink how student activity should be organized considering the differences that exist. I think it should be much more rigorous. For students who work in the academy, the difference is things like this. I'll say, we're going to have a sacred scripture course, and you need to read every single chapter of sacred scripture. And for every single chapter, you need to answer 7, 8, 9 general assessment questions to develop and demonstrate your knowledge of that chapter of scripture. And you could say, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. What, they're going to read every single chapter? No, you're right. In 1990, that would have been almost impossible because you're working with a 15-week semester. But why are we talking about a 15-week semester in 2024? Why are we having the kids read a survey of the Bible as if this isn't the time where they should read the whole Bible? What are they going to do in their formal years of schooling? They're going to read surveys, and then what? They're going to do all of the complete reading in their leisure time as adults? No, this is the time for them to not read a survey of the Bible, but to actually survey the Bible, to read every chapter, as many as they can. And because they have 24/7 access to the study materials, because they can submit and work on these assignments anytime, any day, all year round, they're not restricted by any seasonal schools. None of them are out harvesting hay in June and September. They're sitting around with nothing to do, and they could be studying, and they should be studying. And they've got 24-hour, 365-day access to their study materials. They can and should study more. The studies, because of the technology, should be more rigorous. They can be asked to do things today that we could not ask students to do 20 years ago. And they should be. They should be asked to do much more difficult things because they can. Whereas students then could not do these things. They didn't have access to the study materials. They didn't have ways of communicating or getting help. They didn't have ways to submit these assignments. There are so many advantages today, and these advantages allow us to do more work. We shouldn't be doing less work because of technology. We should be doing more work because of technology. Kids should be asked more questions. They should be made to study more carefully, more thoroughly, more completely. Courses can extend over multiple years. We don't need to fit everything into a 15-week or 36-week box as if that's something real and necessary. That's arbitrary. That's artificial. The whole school calendar is artificial. And it's no longer reasonable to study as if it's 1850 or 1990. Everything is different. So the activities students do, the work students do, the rigor of the work they do, the grading demands. Let me give you an example. Students submit work to me, and I demand that it be perfect. And if it's not perfect, I don't let them pass. I can tell that the student did the reading. I can tell that the student understands the material. But if the student doesn't get every single question right, I give him a passing grade, and I return it to him, and I tell him to fix it and resubmit it. Why? Because we can. We couldn't do that. When I was a classroom teacher, I could not do that. I couldn't have a student come to me, write out 2 pages of answers to questions on paper, and then hand him his paper back and tell him to go back and redo that and rewrite this and resubmit the papers. there would be millions of papers all over the place. Even though I did do that, that was always my policy as a teacher. You could turn in assignments as often as you wanted until you got perfect scores, because that was my goal, to lead them all to perfect scores. But today, with the internet, that's no problem. It's just digits in a database. It's nothing. I'm not getting any papers. There's nothing that needs to be exchanged. It's just sending messages back and forth with information, digital information. And so there's reason to be more demanding in assessment today because of the convenience with which we can share information. It allows standards to go higher, to become more rigorous, more challenging, not easier, not less challenging. Courses shouldn't be getting done quicker because we're keeping the same course content, but now it's so much. No, these tools, the resources we have, the online studies, the online courses, and so on, allow us to do more. And we've got to rethink everything. We've got to rethink how courses work, how school works, what the goal of education is, how that goal is served, what the objectives should be, what the teaching methods should be, how schools should be arranged, if at all. Everything needs to be rethought because the circumstances today are totally different. And there are many advantages practically. Education becomes much more sustainable. When I prepare materials for a course, when I prepare assessments, when I prepare lessons and so on, I prepare them once and they can be used by students forever. So I'm preparing a course once and then maybe revising some pieces, improving some parts. But when I do work, I do it once for all. When I create an assessment, I create it once for all. My work as a teacher changes. I'm not restarting courses every year. I'm not getting assigned to different courses and having all the work I did for a previous course now lost. And now I've got to start over from scratch because I'm teaching a different course to a different grade level or different students with a different textbook and so on. The curriculum is actually a curriculum in our program. It doesn't change. Older kids see their younger brothers and sisters studying the exact same lessons they did. There's an actual academic culture in our program because we're no longer constantly stirring everything up because of the geographical limitations of schools or the artificial modern school schedule. Everything can remain consistent and regular and routine. And if we do work, it's once for all. And if we do more work, it's just to make what already exists better. We're not throwing it away and starting from scratch every year. We don't have any teacher we're not dependent on teachers. There's none of that turnover problem, none of that chaos. We actually have a permanent curriculum. Now, what's different for me as a teacher is that my work changes. When I was a classroom teacher, I was stupidly preparing lectures and activities for the kids to do for 180 days of the school year. And I was overseeing all of this activity to keep the days filled with very little actual work by the students, very little assessment, very little review, and so on. Today, it's the other way around. I do almost no work to present students with the information, and I spend all of my time reviewing work that the students are actually doing. The students are actually doing work. Lots and lots of work. And my principal job today is to review their work and give them feedback, to grade their work, give them feedback. And I work with the students who are actually working. I don't have a class where half the class is just taking up space and I've got to try to make them show signs of life. No, there's no more nonsense in education because everyone has access to the information, resources. It's a matter of will. And the students who choose to do the work are the students who should get the attention, because the other students have no excuse. They have no excuse. They can't say their parents can't afford it. They can't say they can't afford books. They can't blame their teachers. There's no excuses anymore in education. You just sit down and work and turn in your work, and your work gets reviewed, and you move forward and move forward and move forward. You can study as many hours a day as you want to, as many days of the year as you want to. There's no more excuses to say, oh, well, I have ADHD, so then study less, or study in shorter periods. There's no more excuse. You're not being stuck in a classroom with 25 other kids and being told to keep up with the talented kids. You have your own schedule. You have your own resources, your own access. You're in control. There's no more excuse. And so the work of the teacher becomes much more focused on correcting work, reviewing work, grading work, giving feedback, and so on, to work that the students are made to do. And the students can be made to work through much more rigorous assignments because we just don't have the limitations that we had in classes, in school calendars, and so on. So anyway, there's a lot to think about here, and I know I've gone over an hour, so I want to cut this off, but the technology that's available today requires for a complete rethinking of education. It doesn't mean we throw out classical liberal arts education, doesn't mean we throw out philosophy and theology, doesn't mean we stop studying math and the sciences. As human beings, the content is not going to change. The philosophical sciences are still the philosophical sciences. The liberal arts are still the liberal arts. That's not going to change. What we have to ask is how we should be studying these things, how we should be leading students through these things, what the standards should be, what the goals should be, what the actual methods should be, because everything has changed. And what modern schools and colleges are doing just makes no sense. It's a matter of time before people wake up and realize they don't have to keep walking in those paths. They don't have to keep jumping through those hoops, because those paths lead nowhere, and those hoops are no longer necessary. And when parents realize this, when students realize this, they can just get after real education and find that there's no more limitations. There's no more limitations to what can be studied, at what quality or level it can be studied. There's no more cost limitations, no more geographical locations. You're no longer limited by who happens to be teaching in the town you live in. You're no longer limited by your parents' income or what profession your parents have, because the education is almost free. Look at the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. Enrollment is $25 a month. That's it, for everything. There's no more excuses. Everything needs to be rethought, and the sooner we get our heads wrapped around this, the better we'll be. And it's just a matter of time. But this, in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, this is the work that I'm seeking to do. And, just the possibilities, sometimes I think about it and I just feel like my head's going to explode, because everything is different. There's the restrictions that we think about are not real. And when we finally act on this reality, that's when education is going to be revived in a way that it may have never existed in history. So anyway, lots to think about. I hope that's helpful. I look forward to questions and comments, and we'll take up this topic again in more detail in the future, because it's really the ultimate topic here with respect to education. I hope that's helpful. God bless.